Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know about a great speech as interjected by the member. I think Mr. Bakshi should sack the researcher who carefully drafted those notes that he read out. And I do so on the basis, frankly, that they are factually incorrect. If the member looks at the facts, he will read that crime in New Zealand has in fact been declining, the trend lines, since the 1990s. If he looks at the facts, and I can help him with a little institutional memory because I was in Parliament over that period of time, the major pieces of reform of legislation in this area were conducted under the last government. The Parole Act, the Sentencing Act, the very act that this parole bill amends halved the rate of reoffending of people on parole. If the member doesn't believe me, read the regulatory impact statement on the table. It tells him that. The Parole Act toughened the legislation. It said that safety must be the paramount consideration of the parole board, and the parole board should not take decisions that put the public at undue risk. I made those changes at a certain cost. The cost was that people who should not be released from prison were not released from prison, and prison numbers went up. This bill, and I don't condemn it for that, won't increase the day spent in prison by any prisoner in any way at all. I support this bill. But please, Mr. Bakshi, get the facts right. The changes in the prison system about rehabilitation, about education, about providing work, about dealing with drug and alcohol problems began in the first decade of the 20th century. And to give credit to this government, they continued it. But let's not bend the facts for political purposes. And when I say that, Mr. Speaker, I want to take a moment to acknowledge, as my colleague Jacinda Ardern did, the passing of Cecilia Lashley. She was a woman that I hugely admired. She was passionate about what she did. She was utterly committed and dedicated. It was a way of life for her to do something to help the people who ended in our prison system or to keep people out of the prison system. And the thing that Cecilia Lashley would have most condemned was the politicisation to score political points of law and order issues. That's what she deplored. That's what she deplored. Read what she wrote, Mr. Bishop. You will see for yourself. She looked at this from the eyes of a person that wanted to make life better for the individuals who ended up in the correction system and so keep New Zealanders safe, because she would address the causes of the offending and not treat the symptoms. And as we consider any piece of legislation like that, we should keep her philosophy, her principles and her values in mind. And I pay tribute to her memory. Mr. Speaker, we support the changes in this bill. We supported them in the first reading of the bill and through the Select Committee and through subsequent readings. And we support them because these are rational and sensible changes to make. The Parole Board, to whom we give responsibility to act under this legislation, would also support the changes that are being made, and also made the point that, if anything, this will not extend the time people spend in prison, but it may well reduce it. But it will do so on a rational basis. Mr. Speaker, parole is a controversial area. From time to time, the Parole Board will make mistakes. They will make mistakes because of not having the full information they need, or they will simply make mistakes because human behaviour in this area is not always predictable. But generally, they will get it right. And what was noticeable for people appearing before the Select Committee on this bill is that everybody, from the hardliners on law and order, the Sensible Sentencing Trust, right down to people like Kim Workman from Rethinking Crime and Justice, said the Parole Board did a pretty good job. And one of the things the Parole Board has remarked upon is that they were seeing people 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times before the parole board, before they made the decision that the person was ready for release. And because in the original legislation we restricted the period of time for review by the parole board to every 12 months, which effectively meant often, every 11 months they would be looking at the person, the offenders were coming before the parole board without having completed their rehabilitation programs. And the offender knew, and the prison managers knew, and the parole board knew that this was not the right time for their release. So this is not a hardline law and order issue. This is simply saying, let's give the parole board the flexibility to determine that maybe a person doesn't need to come before the parole board every 12 months. They may come before the parole board every 2 years initially. And it gives the parole board that additional flexibility that I think is really sensible, that if a person actually achieves their rehabilitation goals early, then they can come before the parole board early and be released early. Now, I know there are some people that say there should be no parole. We've had from time to time from the ACT Party and from the right wing of the National Party a preaching of these words, truth in sentencing. Let them serve to the last day of the sentence and then release them. That sounds good in the electorate when people are concerned about law and order issues, but what actually happens in practice is that that doesn't work. For a start, you end up keeping 3/4 of the people who would not re-offend in prison longer than they need to, and at the cost of over $90,000 a prisoner a year, we're spending a hell of a lot of money to no good public purpose. So if a person is ready to release because they have shown remorse, they have acknowledged the causes of their offending, and they're unlikely to re-offend, why would you keep them till the last day of the sentence? Doesn't make sense at all. But there's another factor, Mr. Speaker, and it's this, that where offenders are kept to the last day of their sentence and then released, the empirical evidence quite clearly shows they are much more likely to re-offend. So what do? Do you release them, sudden death? They go from total confinement to total liberty? Dumb. Really stupid thing to do. It increases the rate of re-offending. Or do you put them on parole, where they have to report weekly to a probation officer, where they're under the close supervision of a probation officer, where they can be directed as to where they live, work and who they associate with? That works, Mr. Speaker. That works, and that's the system that we should sustain, and this bill actually improves the way that system works, and that's why I'm supporting it and the Labor Party is supporting it. Mr. Speaker, the critical change, as I mentioned, is that the parole board now has the ability, the flexibility to determine that there will be a wider space between parole hearings where appropriate. The parole board also, as I mentioned before, can bring forward parole hearings, and the parole board can also issue postponement orders. Postponement orders allow them to extend the period between parole hearings to 5 years, as against the normal restriction of a 2-year period. But that will be done only where a prisoner is serving an indeterminate sentence, a life sentence or preventive detention, or where a person is on a determinate sentence but has more than 10 years in prison. And so postponement orders won't be used frequently, but they are available as they were under the last Act, but they're extended to that 5-year period. I think this bill strikes the balance between protection of the community, the rehabilitative needs of those who are in prison, the need for the community to be safe, and a rational system that will cut down the number of parole hearings, but not in a way that disadvantages the offender, but in a way that is rational.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. The time has come for me to leave the chair. Members, this debate is interrupted and set down for resumption next sitting day. And the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening.